Well, welcome, Maylei and Judy. Maylei Blackwell and Judy Wu from UCLA and UC Irvine, who co-convened the UCHRI Resident Research Group on Rethinking Transnational Feminisms. We're here just to have a conversation about what you thought the group would be about going in, what you aimed to achieve, what you thought you achieved coming out, and the ongoing work. I mean, obviously transnational feminisms has now a couple of decade-old sort of engagements at least in something like this terms, and the rethinking a decade and a half or two on of course is timely. So I'm wondering what you were thinking about in terms of what you took or what you have taken that needed to be rethought, and how you went about with the group to do that.
Do you want to start? Okay. We're like, who's going to start? I think for me, rethinking transnational feminism, the working group was really important. I had worked on some of those themes early on in my career and almost abandoned them because they didn't align well conceptually on the conceptual terrain I was working on in terms of indigenous social movements and indigenous migration. So I feel like in our working group, we really had some important conversations about recentering, conversations around settler colonialism, how transnational processes work with settler states, recentering how U.S. black women, not just in a diasporic framework, but also in a transnational framework, how their experiences can be understood. So for me, I feel like it was a really fertile and rich discussion of being able to recalibrate the frameworks that have been well documented and discussed. What did you
Yeah, no, absolutely.
find?
I agree with that. This conversation that came out of UCHRI is in some ways a third formulation of this community. I formally edited Frontiers, a journal of women's studies, and we sponsored a transnational feminism summer camp at Ohio State University, and Maylei Blackwell was one of the people who came and spoke on that topic. And then there was also a University of Michigan Gender Institute community as well around the theme. And so I thought that the UCHRI was a wonderful continuation, but also departure from those previous conversations because of who we gathered together. I think when we went in, we were thinking about unpacking the idea of geographies. You know, where is transnational feminism located? Obviously, it's transnational, but there's certain regions of the world that tend to be, in some ways, overrepresented in the scholarship. And so we were really looking at communities and locales that have been understudied. So I think especially indigeneity, African American identities, and how we might frame them transnationally. We really wanted to foreground the processes of transnational feminism, so settler colonialism, immigration, empire. I think we were also interested in some themes that didn't quite emerge. So for example, our interest in labor, it didn't quite reflect the people whose interests were in the community, but they took us in other ways that we hadn't necessarily anticipated. So I really enjoyed the conversations related to immigration, settler colonialism. How are these processes racializing various groups in different ways, in some ways contradictory ways, so that an immigrant might in some ways sustain a settler colonial state, even if they themselves are subjected to marginalization and unequal statuses within that nation. We also really had interesting conversations about archives. Some of us are trained in histories, others are not, but we all utilize that term to think about what type of materials are relevant for the type of scholarship that we want to pursue, and also the methodologies that we want to utilize to analyze those type of archives. And I think a third theme that emerges is the engagement with the state, that the state is never absent, is still very much present within transnational processes. And we were interested in how the state manifests itself in international organizations like the United Nations, and the ways they develop ideas about human rights and women's rights, or how the state might permeate into the very personal realm of religiosity or consumption practices. So I felt like the conversations were incredibly rich, and it was wonderful to have the opportunity for us to come together and explore transnational feminism through various lenses.
I agree. I would just add that a way that we hadn't really thought about labor that emerged is through affective labor, and our colleague Zeynep Korkman's work on reading the coffee grounds, the kind of psychic and affective labor that was really fascinating.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think we did talk a lot about political economy.
Yeah.
And the way that shapes gender roles, gender expectations, gender performances.
Yeah, so obviously migrancy and migration and care work, in contrast, say, with mining, sort of factor quite heavily into the gender differentiation of labor availability and practice. So were these the kinds of questions you were engaged with?
Yes, absolutely. And I think also cultural production as a form of labor. There was one particular participant, she's a graduate student now completing her Ph.D., but she was really interested in the ways in which media and alternative media, even guerrilla-style media, might foster transnational feminist networks, but also exploring how there might be different expectations of that type of labor, whether you're coming from a metropole location or from the margins of empire, how even doing media labor is very different, even down to the technology aspect of what's available and how do you fix machines and so on and so forth. So now that I think about it, I think we did delve into the theme of labor.
Yeah, and what did you want to get out of it, and what did you get out of it in terms of actual outputs and creations together?
Well, the community is actually ongoing. So even after after we concluded, we've been getting together virtually and reading each other's work and supporting each other. I think for all of us, it was a little bit of a cultural shock coming from the luxury of having a quarter to just think and write and be with one another, to going back to our lives. So Maylei's been teaching a class for 800 some plus students.
Yeah, that's insane.
Others are going back to chairing their departments. One of our colleagues doesn't have a functioning office because it's been flooded. So, all the kind of the daily challenges of being in academia have really intruded back on people's lives. And so it's wonderful to be able to reconnect with each other monthly and read works in progress. So a number of our participants are finishing book projects. And so now they're workshopping introductions and final chapters. Other people have completed articles, including myself. You just finished your book.
I just turned in my book as well. It's called Scales of Justice, the Practice of Indigenous Autonomy in the Age of Neoliberalism, and I drafted a chapter while in residence that looked at the concept of Avyayala as a transnational indigenous scale of resistance, as a kind of counter scale perhaps to the United Nations and the UN DRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but also the processes that emerged from the Beijing conference. And so it was a way to draw on Kuna, the indigenous people of Colombia and Panama. Their epistemology was really taken up to think about the relationship to land, the responsibility to each other, as to kind of an alternative framing for thinking about transnationalism, because transnationalism also transits indigenous nations. So yeah, and then ultimately the demands of the UN process. I think that people started off with that kind of political imaginary, and then have kind of been sucked into the demands of funders and international NGOs. So trying to balance a kind of different political project with the demands of being in an international social movement, I think, is challenging.
I think Maylei's intellectual expertise, but also her connections with academics and community organizers, really enriched our Rethinking residential reading group. We went to USD, University of San Diego, and met with scholars and activists there to think about indigeneity and sort of decolonial pedagogies. We also went on this, what is it? Is it Indigenous Walk?
Yeah, the ancestor
walk.
Yeah.
Which travels from south of us to north of us. And we visit important historic and ancestral sites. So it was I was only able to participate for part of it, but it was so precious to be able to experience that and to think about this history not just out there or back then, but it's very much present where we are.
Yeah, I think people were interested in not just landing here and locking themselves away, but to kind of think about whose land are we on, and we visited different, sacred struggles of Luiseño folks, but also the Tongva folks in Long Beach. So we went on the annual ancestor walk and were able to talk to community activists and to think about that. Another colleague's work also thought about the idea of immigration and its relationship to establishing a settler state. So it was pretty fascinating how these two sets of questions and issues came together. And another colleague was working on relocation, Japanese American relocation, and the idea of creating ideas of Japanese empire and its intersection with settler processes in the Southwest. So all these conversations took interesting and unexpected directions.
And I guess that's another outcome, is that some of our colleagues are interested in pursuing a publication of a reader on transnational feminism and try to rethink the field and center it differently. And that, again, comes out of UCHR.
Yeah, so that would be a collective undertaking.
Yeah. We thought a first step would be, at first we said, no, we're not going to do a web-based project. And then we said, we found really interesting models of a kind of a pedagogical, strategy on how to teach transnational feminism. So we thought that would be a first step. But I don't know, we haven't really made, we needed to make better progress, I think, while we were together.
I mean,
yes, it would be wonderful.
We're committed to.
I think it's because it's growing out of previous connections and it's continue to feed ongoing relationships. But I think these projects will come to fruition, maybe not just in that 9-week period, but it's going to bear fruit long term.
Yeah, so I think it would be fascinating to have the teaching resources as well.
And important for the more general community.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. This was great to hear an update and to find out what you've achieved and where you see it going.
Great. Thank you.
I'm so grateful for the UCHRI for the support that enabled us to have this community.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah, you think, the idea of it sounds great, but really you can't imagine what kind of rich connections and interesting discoveries and the kind of intense dialogue and discussion being together makes. So thank you for that.
Well, great.
Opportunity.
Thank you very much. And we look forward to having you back.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.